We're going to continue talking about damages today with the UCC, how you calculate basic damages for seller breach or buyer breach. And then we're going to move on to discussing the elements that you need to convince a court of when making your damages case. Things like reasonable certainty that those in fact would have been the rough damages figures you'd be entitled to, foreseeability, and then attempts by the non-breaching party to mitigate their level of damages. So we're going to end the class talking about that. But before that, I want us to talk about the UCC damages. And I think it'll be useful just to frame our discussion by thinking about the ways in which a seller can breach in the sale of goods and the ways that a buyer can breach in the sale of goods. And so high level, right, the seller's breach will involve something typically having to do with the actual goods. The seller fails to deliver the goods. The seller delivers them too late in accordance with the contract. The seller delivers goods that are non-conforming. So maybe they deliver the wrong goods. Maybe the goods have a defect in some way. So non-conforming or defective goods. Now, how does the buyer breach their sales contract? The buyer can refuse to accept the goods even though they conform. So even though buyers have the right to reject non-conforming goods, if the goods are conforming, the buyer is supposed to, under the contract, accept them. And the buyer refuses to pay for conforming goods. And the buyer can either do that after the fact, so the buyer has the goods but refuses to pay, or the buyer could repudiate the contract. The buyer could let the seller know before the seller even delivers the goods, oh, don't bother delivering them, I'm not going to pay for them. Right, repudiating the contract. So there's a set of remedies that the UCC gives to sellers, a set that it gives to buyers, and they map onto each other, I think, reasonably intuitively. And keep in mind, these are actually largely mapping onto these concepts of expectation that we've already been talking about in the common law. So, what are buyer's damages? Let's start with that. And hopefully I can get these slides. All right, buyer's damages. So these are for situations where the seller either doesn't get the goods to the buyer or gets defective goods to the buyer, by and large. So the buyer might legitimately need these goods immediately for some purpose. And so the buyer will go out and try to find substitute goods, usually quite quickly because the goods are needed, right, for an immediate purpose. So in good faith and without unreasonable delay, the buyer goes and buys substitute goods. The typical setup is that these goods end up costing more than what the buyer expected to pay under their original contract with the seller. And so the calculation ends up looking like the cover price, and cover is what this is called for. It's called under the UCC. So cover, meaning the buyer has to go and find acceptable substitute goods. Cover price minus the contract price. And then incidental and consequential damages. And again, keep in mind, you always want to subtract any savings. So let's say, for example, a savings might look like, under their original contract with the seller who breached, the buyer was expected to pay for shipping costs. Under their substitute cover, the seller is going to pay for the shipping. And so the buyer saves those costs, right? That would be something that you might subtract from your damages calculations. So cover is going to be a really common form of remedy that a buyer is going to attempt because they need the goods. They're going to go out and find the goods even if they have to pay more for them. Then they'll sue seller for the difference. But maybe we're looking at a situation where the goods are hard to come by. The reason that the seller breached the contract is because the value of the goods had increased. And so the market has tightened up. It's hard to find these goods now. If the buyer decides not to or can't cover, right, by finding substitute goods, then the buyer can sue for the market price difference. So if the market price of the goods has shot up, right, then the buyer sues for the difference between the inflated market price, the lower contract price that the buyer originally expected to pay, plus the additional incidental and consequential damages, keeping in mind, again, savings. Right. Or what if, and this is particularly true in the case of defective or non-conforming goods, the goods that the buyer ends up receiving are less valuable than the goods that they expected to receive. In those situations, then the buyer can sue for the difference in value, the diminution, the decrease in value of the goods, right? Because they paid for goods thinking that they were this valuable. They had great value. Well, they're defective. They are not as valuable. So the buyer can sue for the difference in price. And here, it's essentially a warranty claim. Typically, it's going to be a violation of the implied warranty of merchantability. If you take sales from me, we'll talk about this a lot more. But the basic idea here is that you expected fully conforming, fully performing, non-defective goods. You got something different. You still accepted it, right? But you shouldn't have to pay the same price for it as a buyer. So we will talk about the case that goes along with this, the Chronister versus Unical case tomorrow. Seller's damages. All right. So what do you do if you're a seller? Well, if the buyer already has the goods and refuses to pay for them, you can sue them in an action for price. You have the goods, pay us the money. Okay. Let's assume that the buyer let the seller know before receiving the goods that the buyer just was not going to accept them, was not going to pay for them. Well, the seller can sort of do the seller's equivalent of a cover, although it's not typically called the same thing. It's a substitute sale. Seller sells the goods to somebody else, presumably for less money, if they're going to go to the problem of actually suing the buyer over it, right? Because think about this. The seller turns around and sells them to somebody else for more money, then yay, right? That's a windfall. That's great. Right. Market value, similar idea to the buyer's remedies. If the market price has dropped for goods, and that might be why the buyer is trying to repudiate their contract. Oh, I was going to pay you $1,000 a ton, but now this deal is going for $500 a ton. Why would I pay you $1,000? I'm out. Right. Then the seller can sue for the market value difference. Right, the $1,000 they had expected under the contract, the $500 that these goods are now worth on the open market. And then the final one I wanted to talk about, which we discussed a little bit last class, is the lost profits. And these are largely in situations where we're talking about lost volume sellers. And that's the contract price subtracted from the cost to produce the good. Now, what do we not see in these damages calculations that we saw in the buyer's damages? We don't see consequential damages. Right? And I think that the logic there is typically the seller is going to be the first person in a potential chain of sales. Right? So you may have a buyer, right, who's purchasing goods with the intention of selling them on. Right? And if the purchasers, the buyers, don't get their goods, who are they going to sue? The person who was supposed to sell them the goods. Right. And so the consequential downstream damages for buyers are much more immediate than what you're going to see from a seller, because the seller just expected in any given sales transaction to complete that transaction. So there aren't really consequential damages in the way that a buyer is facing when a sales transaction falls through. So we'll talk about problem 20.10. Last thing I want to discuss for today, and this is a start of a conversation that will continue into next week, are some principles that apply to all damages. I titled this slide Limitations on Recovery. It's not so much, maybe a more helpful way to think of it might be defenses that you can raise to make the court question how much the non-breaching party is asking for. And these apply to all damages, but where you see these kinds of arguments come up the most is in the realm of consequential damages, right? But it applies to all expectation damages. So, for instance, when we're talking about our first concept, reasonable certainty, you might want to think back to our TBS versus McDavid case, right? And the ways in which the various parties tried to convince the court with reasonable certainty what the fair market value of the sports teams at issue were. And so here are big overarching principles that we're going to talk about this week and next. First of all, reasonable certainty. Now, courts vary as to whether they require reasonable certainty with respect to the amount of the damages or just the fact that there are damages. So the basic idea behind this idea of reasonable certainty is that you are probably not going to be able to prove down to a dime, particularly when we are talking about consequential damages, what the damages were. When we're talking about things that flow from the breach, I thought that this was going to be a successful business enterprise and I was going to make X amount of money. Well, some of that is going to be based on actual numerical modeling. Some of that might be based on, previous business experience that you had, but you can't say for certain, right? Nobody knows if there's going to be, a massive global shutdown of all businesses, for instance. Right? So the idea is you don't have to have absolute proof, but the court can't find your damages too speculative either. So the sort of corollary to reasonable certainty is going to be arguments by the side that owes you money that what you are asking for is too speculative. And we're going to look at some cases dealing with those kinds of claims and defenses for class tomorrow. Foreseeability. The idea behind foreseeability is that the damages that you are claiming must have been foreseeable, and particularly foreseeable by the other party at the time the contract was entered into. This, as you might imagine, is hard to put into practice and often ends up being a case of the courts having to try to put themselves in the shoes of the parties. So how comfortable the court is with sort of trying to say, well, if I were a person, or if I were this person in this situation, would I have reasonably foreseen, the kinds of damages and harms flowing from my breach that this injured party is claiming in this case? And then finally, mitigation. Right? And mitigation is actually a responsibility of the non-breaching party to take reasonable steps to stem their damages. Right? And this is often brought up by the party being asked to pay damages, the party in breach, as a defense against the amount of money that they owe the injured party. The idea being, you could have taken steps to lower your damages. That would have been reasonable. You didn't do that, so I shouldn't have to pay the full value of damages that you're claiming here. And so tomorrow, we're going to start by looking at cases around the idea of reasonable certainty. And what I'll ask you to think about as a way to end this video is, if you can't prove something in expectation, what other damages types have we talked about? Okay. And how would you go about proving those? And Hollywood Fantasy Corp versus Gabor is a nice case illustrating some of those ideas. Asking an expectation, having the other party argue that it's too speculative, and then getting into a discussion of, well, what injuries, what damages, what financial harms can you prove? All right. Have a good evening, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.